explore one of the most captivating figures who ever lived. Tonight, we're traveling back over 2,000 years to discover the extraordinary story of a woman whose intelligence, ambition, and political genius would make her the most powerful ruler of her time. Whether you're settling in for the night or simply looking to escape into the fascinating world of ancient Egypt, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this time with us. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, what city or country, and what time it is as you press play. There's something magical about how ancient history can connect us across continents and time zones. If these gentle historical journeys help you find peace at the end of your day, consider subscribing for many more stories that will carry you into restful sleep. This isn't some romanticized tale from Hollywood. This is the real story of Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, whose remarkable life was far more complex and fascinating than any movie could capture. Have you ever wondered how a young woman could rise to rule the most prosperous kingdom in the ancient world, while navigating deadly palace intrigue, foreign invasions, and the collapse of the Roman Republic itself? The answer lies not in the beauty that legends celebrate, but in a brilliant political mind that could speak 9 languages, debate philosophy with the greatest scholars of Alexandria, and command the loyalty of both her people and the most powerful men in Rome. What I'm about to reveal will transform everything you thought you knew about this legendary queen. Cleopatra wasn't just a ruler who happened to be beautiful. She was a master strategist who used every tool at her disposal, including her intellect, charisma, and yes, her charm, to preserve Egyptian independence during one of the most turbulent periods in ancient history. She was the last pharaoh of a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries, and she would stop at nothing to ensure that legacy continued. Today, I'm going to take you inside the golden palaces of Alexandria, where Cleopatra learned to wield power with surgical precision. You'll discover how she transformed Egypt into a Mediterranean superpower, commanded fleets that controlled the eastern sea routes, and built alliances that would shake the foundations of the Roman world. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why Cleopatra's story has captivated humanity for over 2 millennia, and why her legacy continues to influence how we think about power, leadership, and the eternal struggle between East and West. But before we witness her rise to ultimate authority, let me paint you the world into which Cleopatra was born. A world where the great powers of antiquity were locked in an endless dance of alliance and betrayal that would determine the fate of civilization itself. The year was 69 BCE, and the ancient world was experiencing unprecedented upheaval. The Roman Republic, which had spent centuries conquering the Mediterranean, was beginning to tear itself apart through civil wars and political chaos in the east. The remnants of Alexander's empire still commanded vast wealth and territory, while Egypt remained the most prosperous kingdom in the world, its capital Alexandria serving as the center of learning, trade, and culture. Into this world of shifting alliances and constant danger was born Cleopatra VII Cleopatra, daughter of Ptolemy XII, in the magnificent palace complex of Alexandria. Her birth name meant glory of the father, but she would forge a glory entirely her own that would eclipse that of any pharaoh who came before her. The Ptolemaic dynasty that Cleopatra inherited had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. Ever since one of Alexander the Great's generals, Ptolemy I, had claimed the ancient kingdom as his prize after Alexander's death. For 13 generations, the Ptolemies had maintained their Greek identity, while adopting the pharaonic traditions that legitimized their rule over the Egyptian people. Cleopatra's childhood was spent in the most magnificent city of the ancient world. Alexandria was home to over 500,000 people from dozens of different cultures and kingdoms. The Great Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guided ships from across the Mediterranean into the city's bustling harbors. The famous library contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls representing the accumulated knowledge of human civilization. Greek philosophers debated in the marble halls alongside Egyptian priests and Jewish scholars, Roman merchants negotiated with Arabian traders, while African ambassadors conducted diplomatic business in the royal palace. This cosmopolitan environment would profoundly shape Cleopatra's worldview and her understanding of how to navigate between different cultures and political systems. From her earliest years, Cleopatra displayed an intelligence and determination that set her apart from her siblings. While most Ptolemaic rulers were content to speak only Greek and rely on interpreters for official business, Cleopatra made herself fluent in Egyptian, the first pharaoh in her dynasty to master the native language of her subjects. She would eventually speak 9 languages fluently, including Hebrew, Arabic, Ethiopian, and Latin. Her education was extraordinary, even by royal standards. The greatest scholars in Alexandria served as her tutors, teaching her mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric, and the arts of governance. She studied the works of Aristotle and Plato, memorized the poetry of Homer, and learned to debate complex philosophical questions with the intellectual sophistication of a trained scholar. But Cleopatra's education extended far beyond academic subjects. She was taught the practical arts of ruling, including military strategy, economic policy, and the delicate art of diplomacy. She learned to read people's motivations, to identify their strengths and weaknesses, and to craft arguments that would persuade them to support her objectives. Most importantly, Cleopatra studied the history of her own dynasty and the lessons it offered about survival in a world dominated by more powerful neighbors. The Ptolemies had maintained their independence for centuries by playing larger powers against each other, by making themselves indispensable to foreign allies, and by never appearing so weak as to invite conquest, or so strong as to provoke preemptive attack. These lessons would prove invaluable as Cleopatra came of age during one of the most dangerous periods in Egyptian history. The Roman Republic was expanding its influence throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, and several Ptolemaic rulers had already been forced to accept Roman protection in exchange for their continued reign. The question facing Cleopatra's generation was not whether Egypt would eventually fall under Roman control, but whether it could maintain enough autonomy to preserve its distinctive culture and prosperity. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, had spent much of his reign struggling with this exact dilemma. Known mockingly as the flute player, because of his love for music, he had been forced into exile by Alexandrian nobles who resented his accommodation with Roman power. He regained his throne only with Roman military support, making Egypt effectively a Roman client state. This humiliating dependence on foreign protection deeply influenced Cleopatra's political development. She witnessed firsthand how even the most ancient and prosperous kingdoms could lose their independence through weakness or poor strategic choices. She observed how Roman politicians and generals viewed Eastern kingdoms as sources of wealth to be exploited, rather than as legitimate political entities deserving respect. These experiences taught Cleopatra that survival required not just intelligence and diplomatic skill, but also the ability to project strength and confidence in negotiations with more powerful neighbors. She would need to convince Romans that Egypt was valuable enough as an ally to be worth preserving, while simultaneously demonstrating that any attempt to annex the kingdom would be costly and difficult. The challenge was complicated by internal political dynamics within Egypt itself. The Ptolemaic court was riven by factional disputes, personal rivalries, and competing claims to royal succession. Palace intrigue was a constant threat, as ambitious nobles, military commanders, and royal relatives plotted to advance their own interests at the expense of dynastic stability. Cleopatra learned to navigate these treacherous waters with remarkable skill for someone so young. She built relationships with key military officers who controlled the armies that defended Egypt's borders. She cultivated support among the priests who managed the temples that legitimized pharaonic authority in the eyes of the Egyptian people. Most crucially, she established connections with the scholars and administrators who actually ran the complex bureaucracy that governed one of the world's most populous and economically productive kingdoms. This early political education was interrupted in 58 BCE, when Cleopatra was just 11 years old. Her father was driven from Alexandria by a popular uprising, forcing the royal family into exile and leaving Egypt in the hands of Ptolemy XII's older daughter, Berenice IV. The experience of exile was traumatic for the young princess, but it also provided invaluable lessons about the fragility of political power and the importance of maintaining popular support. During the 3 years of exile, Cleopatra accompanied her father to Rome, where she observed the workings of the Republic at close range. She met the senators and generals who controlled Roman policy toward the Eastern Mediterranean, learning to understand their motivations, their factional disputes, and their individual personalities. She witnessed the corruption and violence that characterized Roman politics, but also the efficiency and ruthlessness that had made Rome the dominant power in the Mediterranean world. Most importantly, Cleopatra observed how her father negotiated for Roman support to regain his throne. She watched him promise tribute payments, trading concessions, and military cooperation in exchange for the legions that would restore him to power. She saw how Romans viewed these arrangements as profitable investments rather than acts of generosity, and how they expected increasing returns on their support over time. These observations would prove crucial to Cleopatra's later success in dealing with Roman leaders. She understood that Romans respected strength and were attracted to wealth and luxury, but that they also had a practical appreciation for competent administration and reliable partnership. She learned that successful diplomacy with Rome required offering concrete benefits while projecting confidence and independence. The family returned to Alexandria in 55 BCE with Roman military support, and Ptolemy XII was restored to his throne. Berenice IV was executed, eliminating one potential rival to Cleopatra's eventual succession. But the restoration came at enormous cost. Both financial and political, Egypt was forced to pay massive tributes to Rome, and Roman troops remained stationed in Alexandria as a permanent reminder of the kingdom's dependent status. Cleopatra spent her teenage years learning to operate within this constrained environment. She could not openly oppose Roman influence without risking her dynasty's survival, but she also could not simply accept permanent subordination without losing the respect of her subjects and the independence that made Egypt worth ruling. Her solution was characteristically sophisticated and patient. She would work within the Roman system while gradually building Egypt's strength and her own political capabilities. She would demonstrate her value as an ally while preparing for the day when changed circumstances might allow greater independence. And she would master every skill necessary for successful leadership, from military strategy to economic policy to the subtle arts of personal persuasion. The opportunity to put these preparations to use came sooner than anyone expected, in ways that would test every aspect of Cleopatra's remarkable education and natural abilities. In 51 BCE, when Cleopatra was just 18 years old, her father Ptolemy XII died suddenly, leaving the throne of Egypt to his eldest surviving child. According to Ptolemaic tradition, she would rule jointly with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, who was only 10 years old at the time. This co-rulership arrangement was designed to maintain dynastic legitimacy, while ensuring that real power remained with the more experienced ruler. But from the moment of her coronation, Cleopatra faced challenges that would have overwhelmed a less prepared leader. The kingdom she inherited was burdened with enormous debts to Roman creditors. Its military was weakened by years of neglect, and its nobility was divided into factions that viewed the young queen with suspicion and opportunistic calculation. The economic situation was particularly dire. Egypt's legendary wealth had been steadily drained by tribute payments to Rome and the costs of maintaining Ptolemy XII's restoration. The annual flooding of the Nile, which provided the foundation for Egyptian agriculture, had been irregular in recent years, reducing crop yields and creating food shortages that threatened social stability. Cleopatra's response to these challenges revealed the political genius that would characterize her entire reign. Rather than attempting to address every problem simultaneously, she prioritized the issues that would have the greatest impact on her long-term ability to rule effectively. She understood that political survival required her to demonstrate competence quickly, while building the coalitions necessary for sustained success. Her first priority was establishing her authority over the complex bureaucracy that actually governed Egypt. The Ptolemaic administrative system was one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world, with specialized departments managing everything from tax collection to temple maintenance to foreign trade. But this bureaucracy had grown accustomed to operating with minimal royal oversight, and many officials were more loyal to their own interests than to the crown. Cleopatra spent her first months as pharaoh conducting a systematic review of governmental operations, meeting with department heads, examining financial records, and evaluating the competence and loyalty of key personnel. This process allowed her to identify both the most capable administrators and those who might pose threats to her authority. She made strategic personnel changes that strengthened her control while improving governmental efficiency. Officials who demonstrated competence and loyalty were promoted to positions of greater responsibility. Those who appeared unreliable or potentially disloyal were transferred to less sensitive roles or removed entirely. The changes were implemented gradually to avoid disrupting essential services, but the cumulative effect was to place the entire governmental apparatus under direct royal control. Simultaneously, Cleopatra began addressing Egypt's financial crisis through a combination of economic reforms and diplomatic initiatives. She negotiated more favorable terms with Roman creditors, arguing that Egypt's long-term ability to repay its debts depended on maintaining sufficient resources for productive investment. She restructured internal taxation to reduce burdens on farmers and merchants, while ensuring adequate revenues for essential governmental functions. More innovatively, she launched new trading initiatives that capitalized on Egypt's strategic position between Africa, Asia, and Europe. Alexandria's ports were expanded and modernized to accommodate larger merchant vessels. New trade agreements were negotiated with kingdoms throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. The famous Egyptian grain exports were supplemented by luxury goods, manufactured products, and exotic materials from the African interior. These economic policies demonstrated Cleopatra's sophisticated understanding of how political power and economic prosperity reinforced each other. By strengthening Egypt's financial position, she reduced the kingdom's dependence on Roman support, while creating resources that could be used to build military capabilities and purchase diplomatic influence. But Cleopatra's most crucial early challenge involved managing the complex relationship with her younger brother and co-ruler. Ptolemy XIII was too young to govern effectively, but he was surrounded by ambitious advisors who saw the regency as an opportunity to advance their own interests. These advisors, led by the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, began encouraging the young king to assert greater independence from his sister's authority. The tension between the royal siblings reflected deeper conflicts within Egyptian society about the kingdom's future direction. Cleopatra represented a more assertive approach that emphasized Egyptian independence and cultural distinctiveness. Her brother's faction favored closer accommodation with Roman power, arguing that survival required accepting permanent subordination in exchange for protection. These philosophical differences became practical conflicts over specific policy decisions. When Rome requested Egyptian military assistance for campaigns in other parts of the Mediterranean, Cleopatra wanted to negotiate conditions that would benefit Egypt's interests. Her brother's advisors preferred to comply immediately with Roman demands, viewing cooperation as the safest path to continued rule. The dispute intensified when news arrived that civil war had erupted in Rome itself. Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, the two most powerful men in the Roman world, were leading armies against each other in a conflict that would determine the future of the Republic. Both sides were seeking support from client kingdoms throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. creating opportunities for Egyptian diplomacy, but also enormous risks. Cleopatra recognized that this Roman civil war represented both the greatest danger and the greatest opportunity her kingdom had faced in generations. If she chose the winning side, Egypt could potentially gain greater independence and more favorable terms in its relationship with Rome. But if she backed the losing faction, the consequences could include invasion, conquest, and the complete destruction of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Her brother's advisors wanted to support Pompey, who had previously helped restore Ptolemy XII and seemed to represent continuity with existing arrangements. They argued that backing the established Roman leader was safer than gambling on Caesar, whose victory was far from certain and whose intentions toward Egypt remained unclear. But Cleopatra's analysis of the situation was characteristically more sophisticated. She had studied both men during her time in Rome and understood their different approaches to governing conquered territories. Pompey represented the traditional Roman aristocracy, which viewed Eastern kingdoms primarily as sources of wealth to be exploited. Caesar, despite his reputation for ruthlessness, had shown greater flexibility in his dealings with foreign peoples and seemed more interested in building sustainable alliances than in simple extraction. More importantly, Cleopatra's intelligence networks provided her with better information about the military situation than her brother's advisors possessed. Her sources suggested that Caesar's forces were better organized and more motivated than Pompey's, despite being outnumbered. She believed that Caesar's innovative military tactics and the loyalty he commanded from his veteran legions gave him significant advantages that traditional Roman observers were failing to recognize. The disagreement over Roman policy created an irreconcilable split between the royal siblings that would ultimately determine the fate of the dynasty Ptolemy. The 13th's advisors convinced him that his sister's policies were dangerous to Egypt's survival and that he should assert his authority as the senior male ruler. In 48 BCE, they orchestrated a palace coup that forced Cleopatra to flee Alexandria and seek refuge in the countryside. This exile represented the greatest crisis of Cleopatra's young life, but it also provided the opportunity that would establish her as one of history's most remarkable rulers. Rather than accepting defeat or negotiating a compromise that would leave her brother's faction in control, she chose to bet everything on a strategy so audacious that even her closest supporters questioned her judgment. She would seek a personal alliance with Julius Caesar himself, the most powerful and dangerous man in the Roman world. The decision required her to travel secretly across the Mediterranean, penetrate Roman military lines, and gain access to Caesar while he was conducting active military operations. If successful, the alliance could restore her to power and transform Egypt's relationship with Rome. If it failed, she would likely face execution as a traitor to Roman interests. The journey that would change the course of ancient history began on a moonless night in the autumn of 48 BCE, when Cleopatra and a small group of loyal supporters boarded a merchant vessel in a remote harbor along Egypt's Mediterranean coast. Their destination was Alexandria, where Caesar had recently arrived with his legions after defeating Pompey's forces at the Battle of Pharsalus. The voyage was extraordinarily dangerous. Roman naval patrols controlled the waters around Alexandria, and Ptolemy, the 13th's forces, were actively searching for the exiled queen. Discovery would mean immediate capture and probable execution. But Cleopatra had spent months planning every detail of the operation, using her knowledge of Mediterranean trading routes and her connections with merchant families to arrange safe passage. The ship that carried her was disguised as a routine commercial vessel, transporting textiles and luxury goods to Alexandria's markets. Cleopatra herself was hidden among the cargo, concealed in a way that would later become the subject of countless legends and artistic representations. The specific details of her concealment remain debated by historians, but what matters is that the deception succeeded. Under cover of darkness, the ship entered Alexandria's harbor and docked at a wharf controlled by merchants loyal to Cleopatra's cause. From there, she was smuggled into the palace complex where Caesar had established his headquarters, using secret passages and loyal servants to avoid detection by her brother's guards and Roman sentries. The moment when Cleopatra revealed herself to Julius Caesar would become one of the most famous encounters in ancient history, though the actual details remain shrouded in legend and political propaganda. What is certain is that the meeting between the 21-year-old Egyptian queen and the 52-year-old Roman general would forge an alliance that would reshape the Mediterranean world and determine the fate of both their nations. Caesar was immediately impressed by Cleopatra's intelligence, courage, and political sophistication. Here was a young woman who had risked everything on a desperate gamble to regain her throne, demonstrating exactly the kind of boldness and strategic thinking that he valued in both allies and opponents. More importantly, she offered him something he desperately needed: the wealth and resources of Egypt to support his continuing campaigns against his Roman rivals. The alliance that emerged from their negotiations was based on mutual benefit rather than simple romance, though personal attraction certainly played a role in their relationship. Caesar agreed to restore Cleopatra to the Egyptian throne and provide Roman military support against her brother's faction. In exchange, she would provide Egypt's resources to support Caesar's political objectives and ensure Egyptian cooperation with Roman strategic interests. But implementing this agreement required Caesar and Cleopatra to overcome significant military and political obstacles that would test both their strategic capabilities and their commitment to their partnership. The first challenge they faced was immediate and deadly. Ptolemy XIII's advisors had no intention of allowing their carefully orchestrated coup to be reversed by Roman intervention. Within hours of Cleopatra's arrival at the palace, Pothinus and Achillas mobilized the 20,000 troops of the Egyptian royal guard surrounding the palace complex and demanding that Caesar surrender the exiled queen to face judgment for her alleged crimes against the legitimate pharaoh. Caesar found himself in an extraordinarily precarious position. His own forces in Alexandria numbered fewer than 4,000 legionnaires, vastly outnumbered by the Egyptian army that now controlled the city's streets and harbors. He resolved to the entire eastern Mediterranean. If he could emerge victorious despite overwhelming odds, every client kingdom from Syria to Cyprus would understand that Roman friendship was worth preserving, and Roman enmity was too dangerous to risk. His response to the Egyptian ultimatum was characteristically audacious. Rather than negotiating or seeking a face-saving compromise, Caesar declared that as a Roman consul, he had the authority to arbitrate disputes within Egypt's royal family. He announced that both Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII would present their cases before him, and he would render a decision that would be binding on all parties. This proclamation transformed a military standoff into a legal proceeding, giving Caesar the initiative while forcing his opponents to respond to his agenda rather than pursuing their own. The young Ptolemy XIII was brought to the palace under Roman guard, ostensibly to participate in the arbitration, but actually becoming Caesar's hostage in the process. The proceedings that followed were a masterpiece of political theater that demonstrated both Caesar's diplomatic skill and Cleopatra's remarkable ability to present her case persuasively. Speaking in fluent Latin, she argued that her brother's advisors had violated ancient Egyptian law by usurping royal authority from the rightful heir. She presented evidence of their corruption and mismanagement, while offering detailed plans for restoring Egypt's prosperity and maintaining its alliance with Rome. Ptolemy XIII's representatives, speaking through interpreters, and clearly uncomfortable with the legal framework Caesar had imposed, could only repeat their claims that the young king was the legitimate ruler and that his sister's presence in Alexandria constituted rebellion against established authority. Their arguments seemed weak and unconvincing compared to Cleopatra's sophisticated presentation. Caesar's verdict was predetermined. but his reasoning established important precedents for Roman policy toward client kingdoms. He declared that Cleopatra was indeed the rightful pharaoh of Egypt, but that she would rule jointly with her brother as Egyptian tradition required. This decision appeared to satisfy both parties while actually ensuring Cleopatra's dominance, since she clearly possessed superior political skills and Roman backing. More significantly, Caesar announced that Egypt would henceforth be considered a friend and ally of Rome, rather than a mere client state. This elevated status came with both privileges and obligations that would reshape the relationship between the two powers. Egypt would contribute to Roman military campaigns when requested, but would also receive protection against foreign invasion and support for its economic development. The announcement of Caesar's decision triggered immediate violent resistance from Pothinus and Achilles, who recognized that accepting the verdict would mean the end of their political influence. They ordered their forces to storm the palace and capture both Caesar and Cleopatra, hoping that eliminating the Roman general would restore their control over Egyptian policy. What followed was one of the most dramatic sieges in ancient history, as Caesar's small force of legionnaires defended the royal palace complex against repeated assaults by vastly superior Egyptian numbers. The fighting raged for weeks, with Roman engineering skill and discipline barely compensating for their numerical disadvantage. Caesar's situation became desperate when Egyptian forces managed to cut off the palace's water supply and threaten its food stores. But rather than surrendering, he launched a series of nighttime raids that demonstrated the tactical superiority of Roman military training. Small units of legionnaires struck Egyptian camps and supply depots, creating confusion and undermining the morale of troops who had expected an easy victory. The turning point came when Caesar made the audacious decision to destroy part of Alexandria's famous harbor. To prevent Egyptian ships from reinforcing the siege, Roman engineers set fire to enemy vessels moored near the palace. But the flames spread beyond their intended targets, ultimately reaching the great library of Alexandria and destroying thousands of irreplaceable scrolls. This destruction represented one of history's greatest cultural tragedies, but it achieved Caesar's immediate strategic objective. The fire created chaos throughout the city, allowing him to break out of the palace and establish a more defensible position along the harbor front. From there, his forces could receive supplies and reinforcements from Roman ships that managed to penetrate the Egyptian blockade. Cleopatra played a crucial role during the siege, using her knowledge of Alexandria's layout and her connections among the city's diverse population to gather intelligence and coordinate resistance activities. Her ability to communicate with Egyptians in their own language proved invaluable for maintaining popular support and countering the propaganda efforts of her brother's faction. The siege finally ended when Roman reinforcements arrived from Syria, providing Caesar with enough troops to launch a decisive assault on Egyptian positions. The battle that followed demonstrated the tactical superiority of Roman legions over traditional Eastern armies, even when the Romans were significantly outnumbered. Ptolemy XIII was killed during the fighting, either in battle or through assassination, by his own supporters, who hoped to escape Roman vengeance. By eliminating the focal point of resistance, Pothinus and Achilles were captured and executed, ending the immediate threat to Cleopatra's rule, while sending a clear message about the consequences of opposing Roman policy. With her rivals eliminated and Caesar's legions controlling Alexandria, Cleopatra was finally secure on the throne of Egypt, but her victory came at enormous cost to the kingdom she now ruled. The siege had damaged Alexandria's infrastructure, disrupted trade throughout the eastern Mediterranean, and demonstrated Egyptian military weakness to potential enemies throughout the region. More importantly, the crisis had made Egypt's dependence on Roman protection more obvious and complete than ever before. Cleopatra owed her throne directly to Caesar's intervention, creating obligations that would influence Egyptian policy for years to come. She had achieved her immediate objective of regaining power, but at the price of accepting a relationship with Rome that offered limited room for independent action. Caesar remained in Alexandria for several months after the siege, ostensibly to ensure political stability, but actually enjoying the luxury and intellectual stimulation that Egyptian civilization could provide. This extended stay allowed his relationship with Cleopatra to deepen beyond their initial political alliance into something that combined genuine affection with continued strategic cooperation. Their partnership during this period demonstrated how personal relationships and political calculations could reinforce each other in the complex world of ancient diplomacy. Caesar found in Cleopatra an intellectual equal who could discuss philosophy, literature, and statecraft with the same sophistication as the best-educated Romans. She provided him with insights into Eastern Mediterranean politics and access to Egyptian resources that supported his continuing campaigns against his remaining rivals. Cleopatra, meanwhile, gained an intimate understanding of Roman political culture and military capabilities that would prove invaluable for managing Egypt's future relationship with the expanding empire. She learned how Roman commanders thought about strategy and logistics, how Roman politicians balanced competing interests and obligations, and how Roman society viewed foreign peoples and cultures. Most significantly, their relationship produced a son, Caesarion, whose birth in 47 BCE created new possibilities and dangers for both parents. The child represented a potential bridge between Egyptian and Roman civilizations, but also a complication that could influence succession politics in both kingdoms. When Caesar finally departed Alexandria to continue his campaigns against remaining Republican forces, he left behind a transformed Egypt that was more closely integrated with Roman power than ever before. But he also left Cleopatra with the knowledge, resources, and political connections necessary to navigate the complex challenges that lay ahead. The queen, who had risked everything on a desperate gamble to regain her throne, had emerged victorious, but her triumph was only the beginning of an even more extraordinary phase of her remarkable career. The alliance with Caesar had restored her to power and demonstrated her political capabilities to the entire Mediterranean world. Now she would need to prove that she could use that power to advance Egyptian interests while maintaining the delicate balance of cooperation and independence that successful client rulers required. The years that followed Caesar's departure would test every skill Cleopatra had developed during her education and early political career. She would need to manage Egypt's internal affairs while navigating the treacherous waters of Roman politics, where Caesar's enemies were already plotting their revenge, and his allies were positioning themselves for the power struggles that would determine the Republic's future. But the young woman, who had smuggled herself into Alexandria to forge an alliance with the most powerful man in Rome, had already demonstrated that she possessed the intelligence, courage, and strategic vision necessary to succeed where others had failed. Her next challenge would be to transform her personal victory into lasting benefits for the kingdom she had fought so hard to rule. The Egypt that Cleopatra now governed was simultaneously weakened by recent conflicts and strengthened by its new relationship with Roman power. The task before her was to rebuild Egyptian prosperity and independence, while avoiding the mistakes that had destroyed so many other Eastern kingdoms. Her success or failure would determine not only her own fate, but the survival of a civilization that had flourished along the Nile for over 3,000 years. As Caesar's ships disappeared beyond the horizon, carrying him back to the political struggles that awaited in Rome, Cleopatra stood on the palace balcony, overlooking Alexandria's harbor, contemplating the enormous challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. She had won the first phase of her struggle for power, but the most difficult tests of her reign were yet to come. The woman who would become history's most famous queen was about to embark on the next stage of a journey that would take her from the palaces of Alexandria to the halls of Roman power, from the battlefields of the Eastern Mediterranean to the chambers where the fate of the ancient world would be decided. The months following Caesar's departure from Alexandria marked a crucial period in Cleopatra's development as a ruler. No longer could she rely on the immediate presence of Roman legions to enforce her authority, or the dramatic circumstances of a siege to unite her supporters. Instead, she faced the more complex challenge of governing effectively during peacetime, while building the foundations for Egypt's long-term prosperity and security. Her first priority was rebuilding the administrative systems that had been disrupted during the civil conflict with her brother. The palace bureaucracy had suffered significant losses during the siege, with many experienced officials either killed in the fighting or fled to avoid association with the losing faction. Cleopatra needed to replace these personnel while ensuring that the new appointees possessed both the competence to manage complex governmental functions and the loyalty to support her vision for Egypt's future. The process of administrative reconstruction revealed Cleopatra's sophisticated understanding of how power actually functioned within the Ptolemaic system. Rather than simply promoting existing officials or appointing personal favorites, she conducted systematic evaluations of candidates that considered their technical skills, their political reliability, and their ability to work effectively within the collaborative framework she was establishing. She created new positions that allowed talented individuals from diverse backgrounds to contribute to governmental operations. Greek scholars were appointed to manage diplomatic correspondence and foreign policy analysis. Egyptian priests were given expanded roles in provincial administration, recognizing their influence with local populations and their knowledge of regional conditions. Even some Roman residents of Alexandria were incorporated into advisory positions, where their understanding of Roman political culture could benefit Egyptian interests. This inclusive approach to governmental staffing served multiple strategic purposes beyond simply filling vacant positions. It demonstrated Cleopatra's commitment to representing all segments of Egyptian society, rather than favoring particular ethnic or social groups. It created a broader base of political support for her regime by providing advancement opportunities for talented individuals who might otherwise have remained excluded from positions of influence. Most importantly, the diverse composition of her administration provided Cleopatra with multiple perspectives on policy challenges and potential solutions. When considering diplomatic initiatives or economic reforms, she could draw upon advisors who understood different aspects of the complex environment in which Egypt operated. The economic reconstruction of Egypt required even more careful planning and innovative thinking. The recent conflicts had disrupted trade routes throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, reducing the commercial revenues that formed the backbone of Egyptian prosperity. Agricultural production had suffered from the diversion of resources to military operations, while the costs of rebuilding damaged infrastructure strained the royal treasury. Cleopatra's response to these economic challenges demonstrated the practical education she had received in governmental finance and commercial policy. Rather than attempting to restore pre-war conditions exactly as they had existed, she used the disruption as an opportunity to implement improvements that would strengthen Egypt's long-term competitive position. She initiated ambitious infrastructure projects that would enhance Egypt's capacity to serve as the commercial hub of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Great Harbour of Alexandria was expanded and modernized with new docking facilities that could accommodate the larger merchant vessels that were becoming standard for long-distance trade. Storage warehouses were constructed with improved designs that reduced spoilage and theft while increasing the volume of goods that could be efficiently processed. The famous lighthouse of Alexandria, damaged during the recent siege, was not merely repaired, but enhanced with new signaling capabilities that could guide ships safely to harbor, even during severe weather conditions. This improvement made Alexandria more attractive to merchant captains while reducing the insurance costs that added to the price of goods traded through Egyptian ports. Beyond these physical improvements, Cleopatra implemented administrative reforms that streamlined commercial procedures and reduced the bureaucratic obstacles that had previously discouraged some traders from conducting business in Egypt. New standardized contracts simplified negotiations between Egyptian merchants and foreign trading partners. Dispute resolution procedures were established that could handle commercial disagreements quickly and fairly, reducing the uncertainty that made some business relationships unprofitable. The agricultural sector, which remained the foundation of Egyptian wealth, received particular attention in Cleopatra's reconstruction program. She invested royal resources in improving irrigation systems throughout the Nile Valley, ensuring that farmers could maximize their productivity during both normal flood years and periods when the river's annual inundation was less generous than usual. New crop varieties were introduced that could produce higher yields or grow successfully in marginal conditions. Agricultural techniques were improved through systematic experimentation and the sharing of successful innovations between different regions of the kingdom. Storage and transportation systems were enhanced to reduce losses during harvest and distribution. These agricultural improvements served both economic and political purposes. By increasing rural prosperity, they strengthened popular support for Cleopatra's regime among the Egyptian farmers, who constituted the majority of her subjects. The increased production also provided more resources for export, generating the foreign currency earnings that Egypt needed to purchase military equipment and luxury goods from other parts of the Mediterranean world. While focusing on internal reconstruction, Cleopatra also needed to manage Egypt's external relationships in a rapidly changing international environment. Caesar's victory in the Roman Civil War had established him as the dominant figure in Mediterranean politics, but his position was not yet completely secure. Other powerful Romans continued to challenge his authority, creating opportunities for Egyptian diplomacy, but also requiring careful navigation to avoid backing the wrong faction in future conflicts. Cleopatra maintained regular correspondence with Caesar, providing him with intelligence about political developments throughout the Eastern Mediterranean while seeking his advice on policy matters that might affect Roman interests. These communications served the practical purpose of coordinating Egyptian and Roman policies, but they also maintained the personal relationship that had proven so beneficial for both parties. More subtly, Cleopatra began cultivating relationships with other influential Romans who might play important roles in future political developments. She hosted visiting Roman senators and businessmen in Alexandria, demonstrating Egyptian hospitality while gathering information about the factional disputes and personal rivalries that drove Roman politics. These diplomatic efforts required Cleopatra to master the complex etiquette and cultural expectations that governed interactions between Romans and Eastern rulers. She needed to project appropriate respect for Roman power while maintaining the dignity befitting a pharaoh of Egypt. She had to offer valuable benefits to potential Roman allies without appearing desperate or overly subservient. The delicate balance she maintained during this period revealed her growing mastery of international diplomacy. Roman visitors to Alexandria found themselves impressed by her intelligence and cultural sophistication, while also recognizing that Egypt under her leadership could be a valuable partner for Roman interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. Cleopatra's diplomatic skills were tested more severely when news arrived that opposition to Caesar was crystallizing among Roman senators, who viewed his growing power as a threat to traditional republican institutions. The conspiracy that was forming included some of the most prominent names in Roman politics, suggesting that Caesar might face challenges even more serious than those he had already overcome. This development created both opportunities and dangers for Egyptian policy. If Caesar's enemies succeeded in removing him from power, Cleopatra would need alternative sources of Roman support to maintain her position. But if she appeared to be hedging her bets by cultivating relationships with Caesar's opponents, she might be seen as disloyal by the man who had restored her to the throne. Her solution to this dilemma demonstrated the political maturity she had developed during her years of exile and struggle. Rather than choosing sides prematurely, she positioned Egypt as a valuable ally for Roman stability in general, regardless of which particular leaders ultimately controlled Roman policy. She emphasized Egypt's contributions to Mediterranean commerce, its strategic location for military operations, and its cultural achievements that enhanced the prestige of Roman civilization. This approach allowed her to maintain relationships with multiple Roman factions while avoiding commitments that might prove problematic if political circumstances changed. She could offer friendship and cooperation to any Roman leader who respected Egyptian interests, while reserving the right to withdraw support from those who threatened Egypt's security or prosperity. The wisdom of this strategy became apparent in March of 44 BCE, when shocking news reached Alexandria that would transform the entire Mediterranean political landscape. Julius Caesar, the man who had restored Cleopatra to her throne and fathered her son, had been assassinated in the Roman Senate by a conspiracy of senators led by Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius. The assassination of Caesar created immediate crisis for Cleopatra and Egypt. Her most powerful protector was dead, her son was now fatherless, and her kingdom's future relationship with Rome was thrown into complete uncertainty. The conspirators who had killed Caesar might view Egypt as a hostile state that needed to be brought under closer Roman control. Alternatively, Caesar's supporters might blame Egypt for failing to provide adequate warning about the plot against their leader. Even more dangerous was the possibility that Caesar's death would trigger another Roman civil war that could devastate the Eastern Mediterranean. If competing Roman factions began fighting for control of the Republic, Egypt might be forced to choose sides in a conflict where the wrong choice could result in invasion and conquest. Cleopatra's response to Caesar's assassination revealed both her emotional resilience and her strategic sophistication. Despite the personal loss and political upheaval, she immediately began adapting Egyptian policy to the new realities created by his death. She understood that survival required quick thinking and decisive action rather than prolonged mourning or passive waiting for events to unfold. Her first priority was ensuring the immediate security of her own position and that of her son. Caesarion's existence made him both a valuable asset and a dangerous liability in the complex political environment that was emerging in Rome. Some of Caesar's supporters might view the boy as a legitimate heir to his father's legacy, while Caesar's enemies might see him as a threat that needed to be eliminated. Cleopatra increased security around the palace and established contingency plans for protecting Caesarion if circumstances required his removal from Alexandria. She also began quietly moving royal treasury assets to secure locations outside Egypt, creating financial reserves that could support resistance or exile if her regime faced serious threats. Simultaneously, she launched a comprehensive intelligence-gathering effort to understand the political situation developing in Rome. Egyptian merchants, diplomats, and scholars throughout the Mediterranean were instructed to report on political developments, military movements, and the positions being taken by various Roman leaders regarding Egypt and other Eastern kingdoms. This intelligence network provided Cleopatra with better information about Roman politics than many Romans possessed themselves. She learned that Caesar's assassination had not resolved the fundamental conflicts within the Republic, but had instead created new sources of instability that were likely to produce continued violence and political upheaval. The most immediate threat came from the liberators, as Brutus and Cassius styled themselves, who were attempting to restore traditional republican government by eliminating anyone associated with Caesar's policies. This faction viewed Eastern kingdoms like Egypt as corrupting influences that had encouraged Caesar's allegedly tyrannical behavior. But Caesar's death had also created opportunities for ambitious Romans who had been overshadowed by his dominance. Mark Antony, Caesar's most trusted lieutenant, was positioning himself as the protector of Caesar's legacy and the leader of his political faction. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, was claiming his inheritance and demanding recognition as his father's rightful successor. These competing claims suggested that another round of civil wars was inevitable, creating the same kinds of opportunities for Egyptian diplomacy that had originally brought Cleopatra to power. If she could identify the eventual winner and provide valuable support during the struggle, Egypt might gain an even more favorable relationship with Rome than had existed during Caesar's lifetime. But the risks were also enormous. The wrong choice could result in Egypt being treated as an enemy state by whoever ultimately controlled Roman policy. The complex factional disputes and personal rivalries that were emerging made it difficult to predict which side would ultimately prove victorious. Cleopatra's approach to this challenge drew upon all the lessons she had learned during her previous political crises. She would avoid premature commitments while gathering information about the various Roman factions and their likely prospects for success. She would maintain Egypt's military and economic strength to ensure that any alliance she eventually formed would be based on mutual benefit rather than desperate weakness. Most importantly, she would position herself as an indispensable ally for Mediterranean stability and prosperity, making it costly for any Roman leader to treat Egypt as an enemy. The queen, who had once smuggled herself into Alexandria to forge an alliance with Caesar, was about to embark on an even more complex diplomatic campaign that would determine whether the Ptolemaic dynasty could survive the chaos that was engulfing the Roman world. The political earthquake triggered by Caesar's assassination would test every skill Cleopatra had developed during her remarkable rise to power. She would need to navigate between competing Roman factions while maintaining Egyptian independence, protect her son while advancing his potential claims to power, and preserve her kingdom's prosperity while preparing for the possibility of renewed warfare. The young woman, who had already achieved the impossible by regaining her throne through sheer audacity and political brilliance, was about to face challenges that would either establish her as one of history's greatest rulers or serve as a cautionary tale about the limits of individual ambition in a world dominated by forces beyond any single person's control. The months that followed Caesar's death revealed the true extent of the chaos his assassination had unleashed upon the Roman world. What the conspirators had intended as a restoration of republican virtue had instead created a power vacuum that ambitious men throughout the empire rushed to fill. From Spain to Syria, generals and governors began calculating their chances of seizing ultimate authority, while the Roman Senate struggled to maintain even the pretense of legitimate government. For Cleopatra, monitoring these developments from Alexandria, the situation presented both unprecedented opportunities and existential dangers. Her intelligence networks reported that 3 distinct factions were emerging from the wreckage of Caesar's regime, each with different implications for Egypt's future security and prosperity. The self-proclaimed liberators, led by Brutus and Cassius, controlled significant military forces and enjoyed support among traditional Roman aristocrats who genuinely believed they were saving the Republic from tyranny. But their philosophical commitment to republican principles made them hostile to the kind of personal alliances that had characterized Caesar's relationship with Eastern rulers. They viewed kingdoms like Egypt as sources of corruption that had encouraged Caesar's alleged descent into autocracy. Mark Antony represented continuity with Caesar's policies and approach to governing the expanding Roman dominions. As Caesar's most experienced lieutenant, he understood the practical benefits of maintaining stable relationships with wealthy Eastern allies. But Antony's position was complicated by his rivalry with Octavian and his reputation for indulgence in luxury that some Romans viewed as evidence of weakness or corruption. Octavian, despite his youth and limited military experience, possessed the enormous advantage of being Caesar's legally adopted son and heir. His claim to inherit Caesar's name, wealth, and political legacy gave him legitimacy that his rivals lacked. But his inexperience in governing and commanding armies made him vulnerable to more seasoned opponents. Cleopatra's analysis of these competing factions revealed her sophisticated understanding of Roman political psychology. She recognized that each group offered different advantages and disadvantages for Egyptian interests, and that the eventual winner would likely emerge from a process of elimination that could take years to complete. Rather than choosing sides immediately, she decided to position Egypt as a valuable prize for whichever faction ultimately proved victorious. This strategy required her to maintain her kingdom's military strength, economic prosperity, and political independence while avoiding actions that would make permanent enemies of any potential Roman leaders. The approach she developed during this period demonstrated how personal relationships and strategic calculations could be separated when necessary. Despite her emotional attachment to Caesar's memory and her natural sympathy for his political allies, Cleopatra understood that Egyptian interests might ultimately require her to work with his enemies if they proved more capable of providing the security and stability that her kingdom needed. Her first concrete test came when Brutus and Cassius began demanding military support from Eastern kingdoms for their campaign against Caesar's supporters. The liberators argued that all legitimate governments had an obligation to help restore republican institutions by defeating the would-be tyrants who threatened Roman liberty. The request placed Cleopatra in an extraordinarily difficult position. Refusing to provide support could be interpreted as an act of hostility that might justify military action against Egypt, but providing assistance to Caesar's assassins would constitute a betrayal of the man who had restored her to power and fathered her son. Her response revealed the diplomatic skills she had honed during years of navigating complex political situations. Rather than giving a direct answer to the military assistance request, she launched into detailed discussions about Egypt's current security challenges and financial obligations that made immediate military cooperation problematic. She explained that Egypt was still recovering from the recent civil conflict and needed to maintain adequate forces for defending its own territory against potential threats from neighboring kingdoms. She noted that the kingdom's treasury was committed to reconstruction projects that were essential for maintaining the economic stability that made Egypt a valuable ally for any Roman faction. Most skillfully, she expressed philosophical support for the liberators' objectives, while questioning whether their military strategy was likely to achieve the restoration of republican government they claimed to seek. She suggested that premature military action might actually strengthen their opponents by creating the appearance of a foreign conspiracy against legitimate Roman authority. This response allowed Cleopatra to avoid making immediate commitments while gathering more information about the developing situation. The liberators were forced to accept her explanations without being able to claim that she had definitively refused their requests. Meanwhile, she gained valuable time to observe how the various Roman factions were positioning themselves for the conflicts that lay ahead. Her intelligence networks were reporting increasingly disturbing information about the military preparations being undertaken by all sides in the developing Roman civil war. Brutus and Cassius were recruiting troops throughout the eastern provinces while demanding financial contributions from cities and kingdoms that had previously enjoyed favorable relationships with Rome. Mark Antony was building his own military coalition while attempting to forge a working relationship with Octavian that would allow Caesar's supporters to present a united front against their enemies. The negotiations between these two ambitious men were proceeding slowly and with obvious mutual suspicion, but their success or failure would determine the balance of forces in any future conflict. Octavian was demonstrating political skills that surprised observers who had dismissed him as an inexperienced youth trading on his adoptive father's reputation. He was systematically building support among Caesar's veteran soldiers, while cultivating relationships with senators who had been neutral during the initial crisis following the assassination. Most ominously for Egypt's security, all of the competing factions were viewing Eastern kingdoms as potential sources of the wealth and military support they needed for their campaigns against each other. The days when Egypt could maintain its independence through careful neutrality were clearly ending, replaced by a situation where active partnership with one side or another would become unavoidable. Cleopatra understood that delay could only postpone rather than prevent the difficult choices that lay ahead. But she also recognized that premature action could prove even more dangerous than continued neutrality. The key was identifying the moment when the balance of forces had shifted sufficiently to make a reasonably confident prediction about the likely outcome of the Roman power struggle. That moment arrived in the autumn of 43 BCE, when news reached Alexandria that would fundamentally alter Cleopatra's strategic calculations. Mark Antony and Octavian had overcome their mutual suspicions sufficiently to form a formal alliance, creating the Second Triumvirate along with Marcus Lepidus, another of Caesar's former lieutenants. The formation of this three-man coalition gave Caesar's supporters significant advantages in resources and military strength compared to the liberators. More importantly, for Egyptian interests, it suggested that the ultimate victors in the Roman civil war would likely be individuals who shared Caesar's pragmatic approach to governing eastern territories. But the triumvirate's first actions revealed the ruthless methods they were prepared to employ against anyone they considered an enemy. They published prescription lists containing the names of hundreds of Romans who were declared enemies of the state, with rewards offered for their deaths and their property confiscated to fund military operations. Among those prescribed was Cicero, the greatest orator of his generation, whose speeches against Mark Antony had made him a target for elimination. The murder of such a respected figure demonstrated that the triumvirs were willing to sacrifice traditional Roman values and institutions to achieve their political objectives. For Cleopatra, the triumvirate's formation represented both an opportunity to align with the likely winners and a warning about the consequences of being perceived as an enemy. The men who had ordered Cicero's death would not hesitate to destroy Egypt if they viewed the kingdom as a threat to their interests or security. Her response to this development showed how thoroughly she had learned the lessons of her earlier political crises. Rather than waiting for the triumvirs to approach her with demands or requests, she took the initiative in establishing communication with their representatives and expressing Egypt's willingness to contribute to their cause. She dispatched embassies to both Antony and Octavian, carefully crafting messages that emphasized Egypt's historical friendship with Caesar and its desire to support his legitimate heirs against those who had murdered him. The communications were designed to appear as expressions of loyalty and friendship, rather than desperate attempts to avoid being added to the prescription lists. More substantively, she began preparing concrete offers of assistance that would demonstrate Egypt's value as an ally, while not committing resources so extensively that the kingdom would be left defensively vulnerable. Egyptian grain shipments were redirected to supply Roman armies, generating goodwill while reducing the food supplies that might be available to the triumvir's enemies. Egyptian naval forces were quietly positioned to control sea routes that could be used by Brutus and Cassius to move troops or supplies between their bases in the eastern provinces. These deployments were presented as routine security measures, but their strategic implications were clear to anyone familiar with Mediterranean maritime operations. Most importantly, Cleopatra opened negotiations for providing direct financial support to the triumvirate's military operations. Egypt's legendary wealth could fund the purchase of equipment, the hiring of mercenaries, and the construction of siege engines that would give the triumvirs decisive advantages in their campaigns against the liberators. These initiatives required Cleopatra to overcome significant domestic opposition from Egyptian nobles and advisors who questioned the wisdom of involving their kingdom so directly in Roman political conflicts. Many argued that Egypt's interests would be better served by maintaining neutrality until the outcome of the civil war became clear. The debates within Cleopatra's court revealed the different perspectives that influenced Egyptian policymaking. During this crucial period, conservative advisors emphasized the risks of backing the wrong side in a conflict where miscalculation could result in conquest and the destruction of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Military commanders worried that committing Egyptian resources to support Roman operations would leave the kingdom vulnerable to attack from traditional enemies, who might view the civil war as an opportunity to settle old scores or seize valuable territory. Economic advisors calculated the enormous costs of supporting Roman military operations while maintaining Egypt's own defensive capabilities and continuing the internal reconstruction projects that were essential for long-term prosperity. But Cleopatra's analysis of the situation convinced her that the risks of neutrality were greater than the dangers of active involvement. She understood that the triumvirs viewed kingdoms that remained neutral as potential enemies who could not be trusted with important strategic responsibilities. More importantly, she recognized that this civil war represented Egypt's best opportunity in generations to forge a relationship with Rome based on genuine partnership rather than subordination. If she could demonstrate Egypt's value during the triumvir's struggle for power, She might be able to negotiate terms that would preserve Egyptian independence while providing the security that had become essential for survival in the Roman-dominated Mediterranean. Her decision to support the triumvirate was also influenced by intelligence reports suggesting that Brutus and Cassius were planning to establish more direct Roman control over Eastern kingdoms, regardless of whether those kingdoms had supported their cause. The liberators' commitment to traditional republican values apparently included opposition to the autonomous client relationships that had allowed places like Egypt to maintain their distinctive institutions and cultural practices. The choice between supporting the triumvirs or remaining neutral was therefore not really a choice between involvement and non-involvement in Roman affairs. It was a choice between active partnership with Romans, who had demonstrated flexibility in their approach to governing Eastern territories, and passive submission to Romans, who viewed Eastern kingdoms as obstacles to be eliminated rather than assets to be preserved. Cleopatra's commitment to supporting the triumvirate was formalized through a series of agreements negotiated during the winter of 43 BCE. Egyptian representatives met with Roman officials in Cyprus and Rhodes to establish the specific terms under which Egypt would contribute to the campaign against Brutus and Cassius. The agreements that emerged from these negotiations represented a significant evolution in Egypt's relationship with Rome. Unlike the previous arrangements that had characterized Egypt as a client state, providing tribute in exchange for protection, the new agreements treated Egypt as an allied kingdom, contributing to joint military operations for mutual benefit. Egypt would provide naval forces, financial resources, and logistical support for Roman operations in the Eastern Mediterranean. In exchange, the triumvirs guaranteed Egyptian territorial integrity, promised to consult with Cleopatra on policy matters affecting the eastern provinces, and agreed to recognize Caesarion as a legitimate member of Caesar's family with potential claims to inheritance. This last provision was particularly significant because it represented the first formal Roman recognition of Cleopatra's son's paternity and political status. The acknowledgement created new possibilities for Caesarion's future, while also providing him with protection against those who might view him as a threat to Roman stability. The implementation of these agreements required Cleopatra to mobilize Egyptian resources on a scale not seen since the great military campaigns of the early Ptolemaic period. Ships were assembled and equipped for extended naval operations. Treasure was gathered from temples and royal storehouses to fund Roman military expenses, and diplomatic representatives were dispatched to coordinate Egyptian activities with Roman strategic planning. But the most crucial aspect of Egypt's contribution to the triumvir's cause would be Cleopatra's personal involvement in the campaign against Brutus and Cassius. The agreement specified that she would personally command Egyptian naval forces during the decisive battle that would determine the fate of the Roman Republic. This provision transformed Cleopatra from a distant ally providing support for Roman operations into an active participant in the military campaign that would reshape Mediterranean politics. Her success or failure during the upcoming battle would determine not only the outcome of the Roman civil war, but also her own position as one of the most powerful rulers in the ancient world. The queen who had once risked everything to forge an alliance with Julius Caesar was about to stake her kingdom's future on an even more audacious gamble. She would lead Egyptian forces into battle alongside Roman legions, commanding ships and sailors whose performance could determine whether the triumvirate succeeded in establishing their authority over the entire Roman world. The teenage girl who had smuggled herself into Alexandria to meet Caesar had evolved into a mature ruler, capable of making strategic decisions that would influence the course of ancient history. But the greatest test of her political and military capabilities still lay ahead